In 1880, a government ethnologist named Clay Macaulay left Washington for the interior of Florida, carrying instructions from the Bureau of Ethnology to do something no federal agent had done with any real care before him: count the Seminole who were still living inside the Everglades and write down how they lived. The assumption behind the assignment was simple and, to the men who issued it, unremarkable. The Seminole were expected to vanish. Removal had been official policy for 2 generations. Most of the nation had already been marched to Indian Territory, and the few hundred people who remained in the Florida interior were treated in Washington as a population running out its final years, not a people with a future worth documenting for its own sake. Macaulay traveled by boat and on foot into a country the maps of his era still labeled in places as unexplored. What he found there was not what the assignment prepared him for. The Seminole he met were not remnants waiting to disappear. They were a governed, self-sufficient people, living in a country they had chosen specifically because no army had ever been able to hold it. And scattered through that same country, in places the Seminole camps sat beside without remark, Macaulay's report brushed past physical things his mandate never asked him to explain: mounds, earthworks, canals cut with a precision the surrounding geology did not produce on its own. He was sent to count people. He walked past a civilization. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Everglades that Macaulay crossed was not, and had never been, an empty marsh. It is a shallow, slow-moving sheet of water more than 100 miles long, rooted in a limestone basin that rises and falls by inches, not feet, and it looks from a boat like the least engineered place in North America. It is not. Rising out of the sawgrass at scattered points across the interior are earthworks built by people who had no draft animals, no metal tools, and in some cases no farming at all, and who nonetheless moved earth on a scale that 19th century surveyors, when they finally noticed it, refused at first to believe was intentional. The archaeological record now groups much of this construction under the name Belle Glade culture, a tradition that shaped the ground around Lake Okeechobee and down through the Everglades basin for more than 1,000 years before any European reached Florida's coast. 2 of its sites carry the clearest evidence. The first sits on Fisheating Creek, north and west of the lake, at a place now called Fort Center. Beginning in 1966, the archaeologist William Sears spent several seasons excavating a large circular earthwork there, a ringed enclosure covering several acres, raised by hand over centuries. At its center, Sears found a pond, and in the anaerobic mud at the bottom of that pond, sealed away from the oxygen that destroys organic material, he found wood, carved wood, effigies of birds, some still bearing traces of paint, shaped with a level of craftsmanship that takes years of practiced skill to produce, and which had sat undisturbed in that mud for close to 2,000 years. Wood does not survive 2,000 years in Florida's climate under ordinary conditions. It rots, burns, or is eaten within a few decades. The only reason these carvings still existed for Sears to find is that the people who built Fort Center made a pond that, whether by design or by fortunate accident, sealed organic material away from the air that destroys it. Sears also mapped a raised burial platform connected to the enclosure by a straight earthen causeway, holding the remains of dozens of individuals arranged with a level of care that argued against any explanation involving casual disposal. Whoever controlled Fort Center treated their dead as deliberately as they treated their water. Sears further argued that the site held some of the earliest evidence of maize cultivation in the eastern United States, a claim later researchers have revisited and in places disputed, but the earthwork itself and the preserved carvings are not in question. They are catalogued, photographed, and in the case of several of the birds, on display in a museum today. The second site sits closer to the lake's southwestern edge at Ortona. There, the same Belle Glade tradition built something even harder to explain away as coincidence: canals. Straight engineered channels cut through the flat interior, connecting inland waterways toward the Calusa River and through it to the Gulf of Mexico, built entirely by hand, without wheels, without draft animals, using tools of shell, wood, and stone. The canals were cut on a grade shallow and steady enough to move water by gravity alone across miles of nearly flat ground. The same problem 19th century drainage engineers would spend decades and steam dredges trying to solve. Whoever built Ortona was not guessing. The main canal runs for several miles, wide enough in places for a loaded dugout canoe to pass, and archaeologists who have walked its length describe finding a coordinated system rather than a single ditch, side channels, holding ponds, and at least one engineered turning basin, all apparently part of one plan rather than centuries of piecemeal digging. To the southwest, along the coast, the same broader tradition produced something larger still, the Calusa, a chiefdom that controlled the Gulf Coast from Charlotte Harbor down through the 10,000 islands, and that did all of this without farming a single acre. The Calusa fished, and the king the Spanish called the cacique received tribute from smaller chiefdoms across the peninsula's southern half, from the Florida Keys in the south to Lake Okeechobee's own shore in the north, a reach that made the Calusa capital less a village than the seat of a small regional power, run on fish, shell tool production, and the loyalty of subordinate towns rather than on grain. That capital, a town the Spanish called Calos, sat on a set of shell and sand mounds in Estero Bay, now known as Mound Key, built up over generations into a platform large enough to hold a chief's house that Spanish visitors in the 1560s described as able to seat 2,000 people under one roof, a platform raised out of shell and sand, one basket load at a time, by a population that likely never numbered more than a few thousand people even at its height. Decades before any Spanish mission reached that platform, in 1521, Juan Ponce de Leon had already learned what Calusa resistance was worth. He returned to Florida's Gulf Coast attempting to found a colony near Calusa territory, and Calusa warriors met his landing party with enough force that Ponce de Leon himself was wounded, an injury that killed him within weeks after his ships retreated to Cuba. When Pedro Menendez de Avilés arrived at Mound Key in 1566 to plant a Jesuit mission and a small garrison, he was not arriving in a wilderness. He was arriving at the capital of a functioning state, one that received him, tolerated him for a little over a year, and then drove his mission out, the same way it had driven out Ponce de Leon 2 generations earlier. The Calusa held their coast for another century and a half after that, resisting Spanish conversion, until European disease and slave raids launched by English allied groups out of the Carolinas in the early 1700s broke the chiefdom apart. By the time Spain ceded Florida to Britain in 1763, most surviving Calusa are believed to have left for Cuba with the retreating Spanish. The people Macaulay met more than a century later were not their descendants. The Seminole nation that formed in Florida through the 1700s and into the 1800s was made of lower creek towns pushed south by English and American settlement, joined by remnants of older Florida peoples and by black Seminoles, communities of enslaved and free black people who found refuge alongside them. They arrived in a Florida that the Calusa and the Belle Glade mound builders had already left. What they inherited was the ground itself. The tree islands scattered through the Everglades, slightly raised hummocks of hardwood forest rising out of the sawgrass, are in many cases not natural accidents of geology. They are built up from centuries of shell, ash, and habitation debris left by people who lived on them long before any Seminole camp was pitched on the same high ground, because in a wetland defined by standing water, a few feet of elevation was the only real estate that mattered, and someone had already spent 1,000 years building it. What Macaulay did record, in the parts of his report his mandate did cover, was a functioning society organized on its own terms. Seminole clans traced descent through Seminole mothers, not fathers. Land and children belonged to the clan, not to any individual. A council of elders, not any single chief, held real authority, and the missionaries and government schools sent to convert the Seminole in earlier decades had, by 1880, mostly given up and gone home, unable to make any lasting inroad. Macaulay documented all of this with real care. He simply never turned the same attention toward the ground his subjects were standing on. He never wrote down what the earthworks were, or asked who had raised them, or connected the mounds his hosts camped beside to any builder at all. His assignment was a census, and a census counts living people, not the ground beneath their camps. Where his report brushes against the older world at all, it does so in passing, describing hammocks and mounds the Seminole used as campsites and burial grounds, without asking who had raised that ground in the first place. That gap is the ordinary shape left behind by any incomplete survey, and it matters because it is exactly where the harder question sits unanswered. The Seminole who guided Macaulay through the interior in 1880 were living on ground that had already been shaped by people who came before them by the length of an entire civilization, and they knew it the way any people knows the history written into the land they occupy, whether or not a visiting federal official thought to write it down. That same ground had already saved them once, a generation earlier. During the 1830s and into the 1840s, the Second Seminole War turned the Everglades interior into the last defensible country the Seminole nation had left. Osceola, captured under a flag of truce in 1837 and dead in captivity within a year, became the war's most famous casualty. But the war did not end with him. Leaders including Coacucci, known to American forces as Wildcat, and later Abiaka, known as Sam Jones, kept fighting from deep inside the sawgrass and the tree islands, ground that swallowed army columns and gave nothing back. Army officers who campaigned through that interior wrote home describing a country that broke horses' legs in the muck and swallowed supply lines whole, where a dugout canoe moved faster than any cavalry, and where a Seminole camp could be struck and moved to a different hammock within a day, leaving a pursuing column nothing to find. Corn grown on the same raised, well-drained ground that earlier peoples had built up over centuries kept those camps fed through a campaign that dragged on for years longer than Washington had ever budgeted for. The United States spent more money and lost more soldiers trying to force the Seminole out of the Everglades than it spent removing almost any other nation, and still did not fully succeed. A portion of the Seminole nation never signed a removal treaty and never left Florida, which is why their descendants today are sometimes called the unconquered people, a description with a specific and literal history behind it, rather than a slogan. Federal recognition took even longer than survival had. The Seminole tribe of Florida was not formally recognized by the United States government until 1957, more than a century after the wars that were supposed to end them, and by then, the sugarcane fields and drainage canals reaching south from Lake Okeechobee were already erasing the last visible traces of the people who had shaped that same ground long before either the Seminole or the United States Army ever set foot on it. Big Cypress itself, the swamp forest bordering the Everglades proper where many of those final holdout camps were located, sits on the same limestone shelf as Fort Center and Ortona, low, flat, and threaded with the same kind of natural sloughs that Belle Glade engineers had once deepened and straightened into canals. A large part of why they survived was the ground itself, built up over centuries by people whose names they did not know, ground that gave them somewhere the United States Army could not reliably follow. The country that sheltered them in the 1840s is the same country Hamilton Diston set out to erase, one generation after Macaulay finished his count. In 1881, Diston, a Philadelphia saw manufacturer, purchased 4 million acres of Florida's interior from the state for $1 million, at the time the largest single land purchase by an individual in American history, and began dredging canals to drain the Everglades for agriculture. His dredges reached Lake Okeechobee within 2 years. Diston's own project stalled before it drained more than a fraction of what he intended, but it set a template every drainage effort after him would follow for the next 100 years, and each of those efforts moved Earth without a single archaeologist present to say what was underneath it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. 16 years after Macaulay walked past the mounds without asking who built them, an ethnologist named Frank Hamilton Cushing got the chance to ask, and the ground answered in a way nobody in Washington was prepared for. Cushing arrived at Key Marco already established as one of the Smithsonian's own ethnologists, part of the same bureau that had sent Macaulay into the Everglades interior 16 years earlier, and his 1896 expedition was funded in part by Phoebe Hearst and organized under the University of Pennsylvania's museum, a partnership built specifically to cover fieldwork the government's own budget would not stretch to fund. He had already spent years living among the Zuni in the American Southwest, and he arrived in Florida convinced, correctly, that the same waterlogged mud that had preserved organic material at Fort Center would have done the same thing anywhere along this coast, if anyone thought to look for it. He was right within days of starting. On the Gulf Coast south of the old Calusa heartland, in another oxygen-starved muck pond, his team found what Fort Center had already hinted at decades before anyone excavated it. The wooden art alone amounted to the largest collection of pre-Columbian wood carving ever recovered in North America. Painted masks, some with hinged or articulated parts that once let a dancer open and close a jaw or blink an eye. Tablets carved with animal figures in a style unlike anything preserved among the stone and shell work more commonly found elsewhere in the southeast, and a crouched feline figure with a human face, barely 6 inches tall, that would become known as the Key Marco cat, an object so finely worked it is still described today, more than a century later, as one of the finest surviving examples of pre-Columbian art from anywhere in North America. Cushing's crew learned within hours what that preservation actually cost. Pulled into open air after centuries underwater, the wood began to warp, crack, and disintegrate almost immediately, and the team worked through the night packing pieces in wet cloth and paraffin to keep what they had already dug from vanishing before it could be recorded. Some pieces were lost anyway. What survived was shipped east, to the Smithsonian and to the University of Pennsylvania's museum, where much of it remains today, catalogued under an institution's name rather than the name of the people who carved it. Cushing's dig proved, in a way no single report could argue away, that the preservation at Fort Center was not a fluke. It was a pattern, repeating itself in mud ponds up and down a coastline that 19th century Florida still described, in official government language, as largely empty. That pattern did not stay buried in the 19th century. It resurfaced, with almost no warning, at the other end of South Florida a little more than a century later. In 1998, a construction crew demolishing an old apartment building at the mouth of the Miami River, on prime downtown real estate already sold for a planned luxury high-rise, began clearing the site down to bedrock. The archaeologist called in to complete a routine legally required survey before construction began was Bob Carr, and what his team found stopped the project cold. Carr's crew nearly missed it. The pattern only became visible once the last layer of asphalt and old building foundation had been stripped away and the exposed bedrock pressure washed clean, at which point a circle of post holes, nearly 40 feet across, resolved out of what had looked an hour earlier like unremarkable Miami limestone. 60 holes and more, some large enough to have held roof support posts, others smaller and packed with shell tools, sea turtle bone, and shark teeth, formed a ring precise enough that later researchers proposed it may have tracked the position of the sun on the solstices. The site belonged to the Tequesta, a related Glades culture people distinct from both the Calusa and the Belle Glade builders, who controlled Biscayne Bay and the Miami River in the same centuries the Calusa controlled the coast further south. And the circle is thought to mark the foundation of a large structure, a council house or ceremonial building, built and rebuilt on the same spot for as long as 2,000 years. Within days, word reached the governor's office. Within weeks, it reached national newspapers. A parking garage and a 40-story tower were already fully permitted for the site, and for a while both futures, the tower and the excavation, existed on paper at the same time, with nobody in Miami or Tallahassee able to say with confidence which one would actually get built. The dispute became a genuine public fight, argued in hearings and covered nationally, and it was settled only when the state of Florida and Miami-Dade County stepped in and purchased the property outright, paying far more to acquire it after the discovery than the land alone had been worth the year before anyone knew what sat beneath it. The Department of the Interior designated the site a National Historic Landmark in 2009. Today, it sits mostly reburied and capped for its own protection, a circle of ancient post holes preserved under a layer of fill a few blocks from the glass towers of downtown Miami, a stone's throw from valet stands and rooftop bars, passed by almost everyone who walks by without a second look. That circle was not an isolated discovery. In the years since, additional Tequesta features, post holes, shell tool caches, burial remains have surfaced at construction sites elsewhere along the lower Miami River, enough that archaeologists in Miami-Dade County now treat almost any large excavation near the river's mouth as a likely encounter with the same buried village, one that operated for close to 2,000 years before a single Spanish ship ever entered the bay. The 20th century did not treat what remained of the older interior sites any more carefully than it treated the coast. As sugarcane agriculture expanded around the southern rim of Lake Okeechobee through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, entire complexes of the Belle Glade earthworks went under the plow with little or no excavation beforehand. Big Mound City, a site of radiating linear embankments north of the lake that archaeologists had only begun to map, lost ground to farming before more than a fraction of it could be properly recorded, and it was hardly alone. Archaeologists working ahead of the bulldozers in those years operated on schedules set by planting seasons, rather than research questions, mapping what they could in the weeks before a field was leveled, and moving on to the next threatened site with whatever notes they had managed to finish. Entire mound groups exist today only as a handful of black and white photographs and a set of field notes filed in a university archive, the physical evidence itself now several feet under sugarcane. The pace only accelerated after 1948, when Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to build the Central and Southern Florida Project, a network of levees, canals, and water control structures built explicitly to convert as much of the remaining Everglades as possible into farmland and flood-proof suburbs. The project succeeded at its stated goal so completely that by the end of the 20th century, roughly half of the original Everglades no longer existed as wetland at all, and no full archaeological survey was ever conducted ahead of a public works project that size. Whatever the Corps' levees and canals passed through, on the way to solving South Florida's water problem, they passed through without anyone counting what was underneath it. Some of what survives today does so almost by accident of geography rather than by protection. Mound Key sits far enough out in Estero Bay, reachable only by boat, that it was never worth farming, and it is now a Florida State Archaeological site. Its shell platforms and the footprint of the old Calusa capital still standing above the water the way they have for roughly 1,000 years. A visitor today can reach it by kayak or charter boat out of Fort Myers Beach in under an hour, climb what looks at first like an ordinary wooded rise, and stand on a platform a Calusa king once ruled from, with nothing marking the spot beyond a small sign. Fort Center's ringed earthwork survives on land that stayed in cattle pasture rather than row crops, spared less by anyone's decision than by what the soil happened to be good for, its outline still visible to anyone who knows the shape to look for in the palmetto. The Ortona Canal segment nearest the county road carries a modest historical marker that most drivers pass without slowing down, though its alignment shows clearly enough on aerial and Lidar survey, cutting a straight line across the interior that no natural creek would ever hold. Modern Lidar, which can strip away tree canopy from an aerial scan and reveal the bare shape of the ground beneath it, has done for the Belle Glade sites in the past 2 decades what no 19th century surveyor walking the sawgrass on foot ever could. It has shown that canals like the one at Ortona were not isolated projects but nodes in something closer to a network, radiating earthworks and linear mounds connecting sites that field archaeologists had previously mapped as unrelated, isolated curiosities scattered across 4 counties of interior Florida. The scale only became legible once someone found a way to see the whole basin at once instead of one muddy field at a time. Large parts of the Everglades interior have still never been formally surveyed by an archaeologist at all. The terrain that defeated the United States Army in the 1840s defeats field crews on foot just as effectively today, and much of what would need to be walked, waded, or poled by canoe to be properly recorded simply has not been, for the same reason it never was in Clay Macaulay's time. Reaching it is difficult, funding for archaeology is finite, and ground assumed to be empty rarely gets prioritized for the kind of slow, expensive, on-the-ground work that finding a fort center or an Ortona actually requires. Taken together, Fort Center, Ortona, Mound Key, and the circle at the mouth of the Miami River are four surviving fragments of the same broader pattern, evidence of societies that engineered South Florida's water on a scale modern audiences tend to associate only with far more famous civilizations elsewhere in the world. They worked without metal tools, without the wheel, and in the Calusa's case, without agriculture of any kind, relying instead on time, coordinated labor, and a working understanding of hydrology that 19th and 20th century American engineers would spend a great deal of money rediscovering from scratch. The Seminole tribe of Florida did not wait for outside archaeologists to decide this ground mattered. The tribe operates its own Tribal Historic Preservation Office, one of a relatively small number of federally recognized tribes, with the authority to review and manage that work directly, rather than routing every decision through a state or federal agency first, and it maintains the RTT Key Museum on the Big Cypress Reservation, opened in 1997, built to tell this history in the tribe's own terms, rather than a museum's. Its exhibits begin not with Spanish contact, but with the deeper archaeological record of South Florida, stretching back thousands of years before the Seminole nation itself existed, a choice that treats that older past as part of the tribe's own story rather than someone else's. The people Macaulay counted as a vanishing population in 1880 are, a century and a half later, among the ones deciding what gets excavated, what stays in the ground, and what gets explained to the public on a South Florida reservation built inside the same interior their ancestors once found through swamp no army could cross. A federal census taker miscounted the ground he was standing on. A civilization moved Earth by hand on a scale archaeologists are still mapping today, and a downtown construction crew came within weeks of burying its own discovery for good before anyone stopped to look. All of it happened inside an institution with a narrow mandate, in a state that spent the better part of 2 centuries assuming there was nothing under the water worth looking for. And the tree islands are still there, thousands of them, scattered across the current Everglades, most never excavated, most never tested for what lies inside their raised ground, still holding, under sawgrass and cattail, and sometimes under a modern airboat trail, several feet of a story nobody in Washington asked Clay Macaulay to go looking for in 1880. He counted 208 Seminole living in the interior that year, wrote down their customs, their self-government, their refusal to be moved, and closed his report, believing he had recorded a vanishing people's final chapter. The Seminole nation did not vanish, and underneath the ground his report barely mentioned, neither did the people who came before them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.